115 years ago last month, the world was abuzz with competing claims about which Arctic explorer had been the first to the fabled but imprecise location known for centuries as the North Pole. This was no contest to be the first to describe the legendary home of St. Nicholas. No, this was an all-out struggle to capture the support of a news-hungry public, with details of a victory that had been sought by 3 centuries of Western explorers. In early September 1909, the New York Herald had trumpeted the success of a 44-year-old American with the headline, "The North Pole is discovered by Dr. Frederick A. Cook." Dr. Cook claimed to have reached the location of the North Pole, determined by sextant readings in the floating sea ice, in April 1908. It had taken him nearly a year to work his way back to a telegraph station from which he could report his triumph. 1 week later, the New York Times went to press with its own formidable claim. Peary discovers the North Pole after 8 trials in 23 years. It detailed the much longer account of 53-year-old Matthew Peary, whose Arctic exploits had seized the public imagination for more than 2 decades. Peary dated his discovery of the pole to April 1909, a full year after Cook's claim to have arrived there first. For months, the contrasting claims, each supported by eager advocates in the newspapers, captured public imagination around the world, and of course helped to sell millions of newspapers. The irony, as Bruce Henderson, the author of an acclaimed volume, writes, is that Cook and Peary, quote, started out as friends and shipmates, end quote. Not only had the 2 explorers gone on several trips together, but Cook, a medical doctor, had even joined a rescue trip in 1901 to locate Matthew Peary when friends and family had despaired of his life. According to Henderson, Cook, quote, sailed north on a rescue ship, found Peary, and treated him for ailments ranging from scurvy to heart problems. While 115 years ago, the all-out publicity war sought to crown a winner in this fabled contest, time has brought other evidence to light. History has more favorably judged the claims of Dr. Cook over those of Peary. At the time, Matthew Peary was awarded the status of Rear Admiral of the U.S. Navy and given a pension that today would be worth almost 180,000 euros annually. As a child, I was taught Peary's claim. Later evidence pointed to the likelihood that his African-American assistant, Matthew Henson, may have been the first on the spot. By the 1980s, Cook's claim was uppermost. Modern scholars offer context to a tale that will probably never have a definable endpoint. It will remain just as imprecise a location as one determined by sextant in a sea of floating ice. Taken all together, it's a timeless tale of colleagues whose reputations have been enhanced or diminished by decades of partisanship. That partisanship obscured the similarity of their goal, the similarity of their methodology, and even the similarity of their outcomes. Depending on whether you adhere to Cook or Peary, you arrive at either the actual North Pole or someplace a few degrees distant. Why tell you of 2 intrepid explorers of more than a century ago whose distinct careers and choices led to still differing conclusions? Because this is a story that transcends the world of Arctic exploration and the vagaries of competing historical accounts and claims. It's a story which has resonances in the story of Adventism. It's a story about the differing traditions that have come down to us about the history of our famed allegiance to religious freedom. And yes, it has meaning for the somewhat differing approaches that have emerged in recent years among honorable leaders about how to apply Adventist principles of religious liberty to the complex and ever-changing issues of human sexuality. It's almost as difficult as precisely locating a geographical location in a sea of floating ice. Through it all, we maintain our quest to be found at the end to be pointing true north as Ellen White put it, persons who are as true to duty as the needle to the pole. I was standing in the corridor of a large convention center nearly 25 years ago, enjoying a conversation with Dr. Richard Osborne. Osborne was then Vice President for Education of the North American Division. I was about to embark on a PhD in American religious history, and Richard Osborne had completed his own doctorate in American history about 10 years earlier. We fell into a conversation whose details long ago slipped into the abyss of my memory. But one salient observation Osborne made has rumbled through the last quarter century of my own study of Adventist thought and writing and teaching about religious liberty. Osborne said Seventh-day Adventists have long adhered to two increasingly divergent understandings of religious liberty. One of those, he noted, follows the trajectory of A.T. Jones. Jones was the famed preacher, editor, and controversialist whose meteoric career blazed across the sky of Adventism from his baptism in 1874 to his departure from the faith in about 1909. Jones went on to become one of Ellen White's primary partners in the aftermath of the 1888 Minneapolis General Conference in the preaching of righteousness by faith. He also served as a co-editor of the Signs of the Times, as editor for a short 4-year stint at the Review and Herald, as a member of the General Conference Committee, and lastly, as president of the California Conference. In addition to the fame which Jones achieved as a powerful preacher of righteousness by faith, his contributions to Adventist belief and teaching about religious liberty have been an enduring piece of our collective memory. Jones had the consummate skill of an accomplished writer and the theatrical talent of someone who could have also succeeded as a showman. Jones took the story of his 90-minute testimony before a United States Senate Committee on Education and Labor in December 1889 and turned it into a major credential. In that era, Adventist contact and even awareness of the mechanics of U.S. government legislation was minimal at best. But Jones presented a story of David versus Goliath proportions. One lone, principled Adventist advocate arrayed against a phalanx of powerful U.S. senators who were debating the merits of the first major Sunday law legislation to reach the U.S. Congress. Jones, by then, had only been a baptized member for 15 years and was a professor of history at a very young Battle Creek College. He faced off against Senator Henry Blair, chairman of the Senate Committee, and the chief proponent of what was popularly known as the Blair Amendment. Blair's bill, which actually never got voted out of the committee he chaired, proposed that, quote, no person or corporation, or the agent, servant, or employee of any person or corporation shall perform or authorize to be performed any secular work, labor, or business to the disturbance of others, works of necessity, mercy, and humanity excepted, nor shall any person engage in any play, game, or amusement, or recreation to the disturbance of others on the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day. End quote. Jones's edited version of the transcript of those hearings was published in a standalone edition of the American Sentinel. That monograph confirmed both the cogency of Jones's rhetorical skill and the heroic nature of his advocacy. While modern historians duly note the force of Jones's arguments, they also note that he was joined by an array of organizations that opposed the Sunday law legislation. Jones should not be considered the person most responsible for the defeat of Blair's bill. But Adventism's collective memory is traditionally a fickle thing, and it has long regarded Jones as the father of the church's religious liberty tradition. He is routinely spoken of in this manner. The threat had been real, Jones's arguments were brilliant, and his reputation was ensured. His claim to the pole, as it were, has gathered momentum over the decades. Ellen White was certainly in agreement with the overall direction of Jones' testimony before Congress. Along with Joseph Bates and her husband James, Ellen White had been among the earliest advocates of the biblical teaching about the seventh-day Sabbath and of the perpetuity of the law of God which enshrined the Sabbath. She was adamant in the belief that the religious freedom envisioned in the founding documents of the American Republic required separation between church and state. Put directly, Ellen White had been an Adventist, and specifically a Sabbath-keeping Adventist, for 25 years before Jones was baptized in Walla Walla, Washington as a U.S. cavalry soldier. The pages of the Review and Herald, founded by her husband, had echoed for 40 years by the time of Jones's testimony before the U.S. Congress, with her insistence that Adventist worship on the seventh day, commanded by the Bible, was secured by the founding documents of the country. She and other founding Adventists, Uriah Smith, J.N. Andrews, John Loughborough, and her husband James, had repeatedly castigated the U.S. government for its failure to ensure the physical freedom and moral liberty of African Americans during the catastrophe that was the institution of slavery. Yes, she envisioned a time coming when the declarations of the U.S. Constitution regarding the full distinction between the church and the state would evaporate. But she insisted on jealously guarding those liberties as long as possible. Thus, while she urged collaboration with the Women's Christian Temperance Union on the vexing problem of America's intoxicating relationship with alcohol, she clearly separated from the WCTU when it urged support for Blair's bill. It was appropriate to make common cause with the WCTU about the civil disaster of America's drunken stupor. But it was also necessary to oppose that organization's advocacy for a national day of rest on Sunday. In a way that wasn't as apparent in Jones's public and written advocacy for religious liberty, it's fully apparent that Ellen White's commitment to religious liberty was profoundly missional. By missional, I mean to say, intended to secure all possible civic freedoms for as long as possible to proclaim the truths which she believed the movement had been raised up to restore. Her arguments, like those of Jones, were grounded in essential biblical values of God's respect for human freedom, God's insistence on honoring human choice, and the New Testament's insistence that there are separate domains for God and Caesar. Two strong and vigorous voices, both speaking into the public square, both advocating for principles of religious freedom. Two friends and colleagues who clearly enjoyed significant respect and even admiration from each other. But their initial modest divergencies in approach have become two distinct strains within the story of Adventist engagement with civic issues. As Richard Osborne detailed in a fascinating 1991 paper which he found for me in his personal files, the divergence between Jones and White on such matters as accepting any form of aid for church purposes from state resources were noteworthy. The consensus of Adventist historians points to Jones as an ideologue, an absolutist, one arguing for what he perceived to be an eternal verity. Jones adamantly objected to the acceptance of any kind of government support or gift for Adventist education. Ellen White, on the other hand, took a decidedly more pragmatic view of such opportunities. The proposed gift of the 12,000-acre land tract in present-day Zimbabwe by colonial governor Cecil Rhodes, now the home of Salusi Adventist University, was heavily opposed by Jones as an unacceptable infringement on the separation of church and state. Ellen White specifically disagreed with this conclusion, repeatedly underscoring her long-standing belief that when God moves in the hearts of persons of influence in both government and society to aid the work of God, the church has every right to accept that aid. This argument will sound truly strange to Adventists in most nations of the world, including here in Europe. In many nations, Adventist education would be unthinkable without government support for teachers' salaries, key education buildings, and resources. In the United States, however, with a modest number of exceptions, Jones's argument for complete, unalloyed separation of the church's finances from any contributions by government is still the official position, as Osborne noted with some dismay. At that moment, now nearly 35 years ago, the church in North America was already facing a significant decline in elementary and secondary enrollment due to the steadily rising costs for operating its system with no public funding. Osborne believed it was the right moment to reconsider Ellen White's more pragmatic approach, as he termed it. While Jones's argument draws on the inherent and self-sustaining appeal to complete and total separation between the church and state, Ellen White's more missional approach would allow the church to proceed on a case-by-case basis. Her approach would note the changing circumstances in both society and economies of scale. Osborne's careful delineation of the distinctions between A.T. Jones and Ellen White has acquired resonances through the years in areas unrelated to education. Jones insisted on advocating for the religious freedom of all people in all times and under virtually all circumstances, as articulated in his testimony before the U.S. Congress. That legacy provided a highly principled and satisfying clarity for Adventist advocacy on behalf of almost every kind of religious organization that finds its freedom to operate in the public square infringed upon by the rules or mandates of government. Seventh-day Adventists routinely make common cause with Sikhs and Muslims, with Jews and evangelicals, with coalitions of well-known faiths and adherents of lesser-known faiths. We defend their rights to live and practice their faith according to the dictates of their own consciences. In a major case decided unanimously in favor of a Sunday-keeping Sabbatarian by the United States Supreme Court in 2023, the General Conference filed an amicus brief with the court in support of the plaintiff's argument that his employer should make an accommodation for his religious belief and not mandate that he work on Sunday, his day of rest. This is only one of the latest examples of the church's long-standing defense of the principle of religious liberty for all persons, irrespective of whether or not Seventh-day Adventists agree with their doctrine or practices. But the decision to follow the tradition of A.T. Jones' more absolutist approaches has had perhaps an unintended effect. Jones's model has sometimes obscured which liberties are truly religious liberties and which are in fact proposed new civil liberties about which the church may appropriately make up its mind on a case-by-case basis more favored by the tradition of Ellen White. Jones's argument that your decision to keep your Sunday, or Friday, is just as much to be defended by Adventists as our decision to keep a seventh-day Sabbath has morphed. It has evolved, I think, into a belief in some quarters that Adventists are required by our religious liberty tradition to support the freedom of all peoples to do whatever they sincerely believe, even when the purposes are not inherently or even apparently religious. Adventists have thus sometimes found themselves in the position of arguing that because the moral code of the Bible is the underpinning of much Western jurisprudence and centuries of legislation in many nations, the proposed rights of those who disagree with that moral code or want to live their lives in opposition to that moral code must be defended as an extension of Adventist belief in liberty of conscience. Here we come directly, at long last, to the heart of the issue. Should Seventh-day Adventists feel required by either our theology or our history to advocate for the extension of proposed new civil liberties claimed by those who disagree with the moral code which the Church upholds in both its teaching and discipline? Is it, as some maintain, impermissible for the Church to argue against late 20th century and early 21st century definitions of marriage as including multiple persons, same-sex persons, or adult-child sexual unions, because in doing so, we would be imposing our moral code on those who believe differently? It's apparent in such discussions that we have moved beyond the classical definitions of religious liberty. By this view, proposed new civil rights that can claim a root in the right to personal freedom must be supported willy-nilly, even as they militate against the biblical worldview which the Church has adopted and for which it missionizes. It must be said, and said clearly, that men and women of faith may and do disagree on these matters. I'm not speaking with any expectation of unanimity about what I'm sharing. Faithful Seventh-day Adventists disagree and have the right to disagree with the historical framework I'm offering, with my characterizations of the traditions of Jones and White, and with the implied conclusions of my thesis. One of the fundamental purposes of this conference, as I understand it, is to provide an opportunity for the Church in the Inter-European Division to think candidly and out loud about some of the most challenging issues with which it's confronted in the modern era. If the paradigm I'm offering has any value, and of course I believe it does, it allows us to take a step back. We may take a step back from what may seem an inevitable acquiescence in the name of freedom of conscience to emerging social constructs about sexuality. We may instead arrive at a place of wise and informed biblical critique of those constructs. We are by no means the only faith group wrestling with these issues, as you well know. Men and women of every Christian faith and many non-Christian faiths find themselves deeply distressed by how to live and practice their deeply held religious beliefs in both secular and even antagonistic contexts. In these contexts, new models of sexual expression have become commonplace in the culture and even enshrined in the laws of many nations. I had an unusual opportunity 2 years ago while visiting in London to witness one congregation wrestling with how Christian faith can impact the way its congregants live their faith from Monday to Friday. At the invitation of a friend, I attended a morning service at St. Helens Bishopsgate, an evangelical Anglican church that dates to the 13th century. For those of you seeking evidence that members of the General Conference Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department are dangerous ecumenists, you may now have all the information you need. Suffice it to say, I visited once, though I will tell you that I have been unable to forget much of what I experienced there. It's a striking experience to sit beneath the high pulpit in an 800-year-old Anglican church and watch it quickly fill up with hundreds of well-off, well-educated young adult Londoners. Most of them work in the city, the famed square mile that houses the most important banks, corporations, and law firms in London. They come back into the city on Sunday morning, even though they work there 5 days a week. They come to hear the word preached with clarity and power, to experience the power of biblical community, and to worship with both passion and tradition. They swarmed into the church in time for the 10:30 preaching service in droves that most Seventh-day Adventist youth ministers could only dream of. It was clear from observing them that they were regulars. I watched in fascination as a young Anglican priest baptized 2 Mandarin-speaking Chinese converts by immersion in a baptistry in the sanctuary floor not 15 feet from where I sat. And the message they heard that morning was anything but words sweeter than honey in the honeycomb. The rector laid out a challenging vision of what belonging to Jesus Christ can mean in Britain generally and in the city specifically. These are places in which political correctness and a desire to be thought well of by peers often overwhelm biblical decision-making. What will you do, he asked his parishioners, when the corporation, the bank, the law firm for which you work requires you to place a gay pride emblem beside your business signature on your correspondence for the firm? He didn't presume to make the biblical case for monogamous heterosexual marriage. He correctly assumed that this was the consensus position of the vast majority of the young adults who had crowded into the church that Sunday morning. He asked his congregants if they were willing to pay the price for upholding traditional Christian morality. He pointed out that if they had not yet had to make that choice in their place of business, they almost certainly would have to do so very soon. Had you asked me ahead of visiting St. Helens Bishopsgate that Sunday morning, I would likely have told you that any young adults who might have come to an Anglican service in an 800-year-old church would have roundly disagreed with the rector. I would have guessed that he might have expected a few catcalls and some hectoring for the unflinching way he laid out his belief that following Jesus would require steep costs. But instead, the hundreds who flocked there that Sunday and each Sunday quietly murmured in agreement. Their pensive faces testified to the reality of the dilemma that he had correctly described. I don't tell this story to advocate for that preacher's personal understanding of how best to address the rapidly changing sexual norms in the nations in which we live. I tell it to note that he was by no means alone in his commitments. This was neither a reactionary preacher nor a reactionary congregation. I found myself quietly wishing that many Adventist congregations that I visited, and some that I pastored, had placed such a significant emphasis on the authority of the Word in our life together. According to Paul, the Word is profitable not only for inspiration, which is where we often leave it, but for, quote, teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work, end quote. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. And so I offer this thesis as a fair summary of my presentation today. Adventist engagement with social issues of any kind, including religious liberty, and specifically in the highly charged arena of alternative sexual expressions, must grow directly from the same biblical foundation that informs our belief in the seventh-day Sabbath, the soon coming of Christ, salvation through the faith in the atoning work of Christ, the non-immortality of the soul, and the certainty of a world to come. The wider public, and yes, the members of this end-time movement, have a right to expect an impressive consistency between the biblical truths we hold dear and the public statements we make on important matters of social or national consequence. Our commitment as disciples of Jesus Christ calls us to love, and not merely tolerate, those who live their sexuality differently than we do. But loving others well does not require us to either agree with or acquiesce to every expansion of proposed new civil liberties that may be contemplated by an advocacy group or even by a national government. Adventist public statements about issues of moral and social concern, rare as they ought to be, should be anchored in the same biblical authority that teaches us to love those with whom we disagree. Obvious as it may seem, it's useful to remind ourselves that our defense of the legitimate religious liberties of those of other faiths includes the right for Adventists to legitimately and publicly disagree. We may disagree with trending or even prevailing public sentiments about sexual expression, new legal definitions of sexual relationships, and the wisdom of moving away from the biblical norms which have provided some stability for our culture. I offer, by way of historical analogy, brief histories of two lengthy and very public Adventist campaigns to change the way society thought about issues of both human freedom and what some would describe as personal rights. They happen to be issues which I have researched and studied for many years, and about which the Adventist record of engagement is remarkably clear. The first of these, intense and active opposition to African American slavery, is a matter of justifiable pride in the history of the church's public engagements. Almost from the first editions of what became the Review and Herald and later the Adventist Review, the magazine's editors, alongside Ellen White, delivered an unrelenting and heavy attack on the United States government for failing to honor the promises of its founding documents. Resident editor Uriah Smith's passionate editorial of March 1857 is typical. Quote, "Says the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet the same government that utters this sentiment in the very face of this declaration will hold in abject servitude over 3,200,000 of human beings, rob them of those rights with which they acknowledge that all men are endowed by their Creator, and write out a base denial of their fair professions in characters of blood. In the institution of slavery is more especially manifested thus far the dragon spirit that dwells in the heart of this hypocritical nation." Listen to what that young visionary, Ellen White, wrote when the United States government passed a law that required every citizen of the free northern states to assist in the capture and imprisonment of any escaped slave who happened to make it into free territory. She wrote, "The laws of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey, and we must abide the consequences of the violation of this law. This slave is not the property of any man. God is his rightful master, and a man has no right to take God's workmanship into his hands and claim his as his own." Adventists earned high praise from Black abolitionist leaders like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. Those Black leaders praised Adventists for their vocal, principled attack on the institution which many modern scholars now identify as the linchpin of the economic success of the American experiment. Adventist opposition to slavery was understood to be universal. Its language was fierce, and for people who opposed the taking of human life in war, their fire was withering. As newer Adventist historians have explored the rich history of Adventist anti-slavery engagement, many Adventist young adults have felt encouraged that the founders of this movement were a race of ethical giants whose commitment to biblical concepts of freedom was as true to duty as the needle to the pole. For a useful summary of what Adventist opposition to slavery looked like, see my 2002 cover story for the Adventist Review, Writing Against Wrongs. Nothing. Not public equivocation on slavery, not historic compromises in the U.S. Congress, not even the temporizing of U.S. presidents and legislators. Nothing dulled the edge of the Adventist attack. The Bible's unwavering commitment to the essential equality of all persons drove the Adventist response to the first major social issue with which the young movement engaged. There was a direct and unmistakable line connecting Adventist belief and Adventist public positions. And as I said, we are justifiably proud of that. Less well regarded by modern historians, including some Adventist ones, is the next major social issue to which the church committed itself. Beginning with editorials and articles in the late 1870s, Adventists began campaigning for the abolition of alcohol. To be specific, Adventist opposition to the manufacture, sale, and consumption of commercially available alcohol became a fixed point. This was the cause for which Ellen White initially encouraged active collaboration with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, even as she subsequently decried their endorsement of Senator Blair's legislation promoting a National Day of Rest on Sunday. It's estimated that Ellen White was likely better known by masses of people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for her advocacy of what Americans termed prohibition than for her devotional writings, her prophetic interpretation, and her decades of preaching. She put all of the considerable force of her strong personality squarely on the side of the anti-alcohol forces. Here's a representative sample of her intense advocacy. Quote, Satan exults as he sees the slaves of evil habit daily crowding under his black banner, going down to misery, death, and hell. We may call upon the friends of the temperance cause to rally to the conflict and seek to press back the tide of evil that is demoralizing the world. But of what avail are all our efforts while liquor selling is sustained by law? Must the curse of intemperance forever rest like a blight upon our land? Must it sweep every year like a devouring fire over thousands of happy homes? We talk of the results, tremble at the results, and wonder what we can do with the terrible results, while too often we tolerate and even sanction the cause. The Adventist advocates of temperance fail to do their whole duty unless they exert their influence by precept and example, by voice and pen and vote in favor of prohibition and total abstinence. We need not expect that God will work a miracle to bring about this reform and thus remove the necessity for our exertion. We ourselves must grapple with this giant foe. Our motto, no compromise and no cessation of our efforts till the victory is gained. End quote. As a historian who has personally reviewed almost all available Review and Herald publications on prohibition from the 1880s through the 1930s, I can tell you that it's amazing to discover the intensity and the tenacity of Adventist opposition to alcohol. Church publications routinely printed battle maps in their pages, showing which U.S. states were wet and which were dry. Because the success of a national amendment to the U.S. Constitution would require approval from 3/4 of the then 48 states, 36 was the magic number of states for which prohibition advocates were aiming. This all sounds vaguely strange to the last century of Adventists in Europe and the US, almost all of whom have grown up in nations and during an era in which alcoholic manufacture and consumption has been a staple of ordinary culture. And we thus make the unwarranted assumption that things have continued as they were from the fathers, as Peter said, which is hardly the case. Author James Vorel observes, quote, by today's standards, average alcohol consumption in large parts of the 19th century USA was almost beyond rational belief, end quote. To illustrate context, Europe has the dubious distinction of hosting almost all of the 10 highest alcohol-consuming nations of the world, for which the annual per capita amount, including abstainers in the count, is approximately 12 liters per year. By way of context, hear the research of author Daniel Ockrent. He documents that the typical American at the launch of the Prohibition movement was consuming, quote, the equivalent of 1.7 bottles of a standard 80-proof liquor per person per week, nearly 90 bottles a year for every adult in the nation, even with abstainers, and there were millions of them, factored in. Once again, figuring per capita, multiply the amount Americans drink today by 3, and you'll have an idea of what much of the 19th century was like, end quote. Frederick Marryat, an English traveler who published his A Diary in America in 1837, wrote that Americans were awash in alcohol in a manner that almost defies understanding. He wrote, I am sure the Americans can fix nothing without a drink. If you meet, you drink. If you part, you drink. If you make acquaintance, you drink. If you close a bargain, you drink. They quarrel in their drink and they make it up with a drink. They drink because it's hot, they drink because it's cold. If successful in elections, they drink and rejoice. If not, they drink and swear. They begin to drink early in the morning, they leave off late at night. They commence it early in life, and they continue it until they soon drop into the grave, end quote. This brief review of alcohol by the numbers may help you understand why Adventists put heart and soul into the push to ban the manufacture, sale, and public consumption of alcohol. Yes, they were informed by the biblical texts that repeatedly decry the foolishness and destruction attending alcohol. Wine is a mocker, and strong drink is raging, and whoever is deceived thereby is not wise. But it was the devastating social effects of public drunkenness, the rapidly rising rates of abuse, neglect, and murder, the wretchedness of families impoverished by alcohol-addicted parents, and the undeniable economic impact of a national public health disaster that got Adventists off their couches and into the streets with banners, signs, and votes. As it turned out, the victory achieved by the Prohibition forces in 1919 was short-lived. Just 14 years later, the necessary 36 states had voted to repeal the constitutional amendment banning alcohol. Many modern Adventists, including some Adventist historians, look at this awkward history as a kind of proof that Adventists had invested in the wrong cause or for the wrong reasons. But trace back through the church's many publications, as I have, and you will again see a straight line that runs from biblical belief in the dangers of alcohol and in love for one's fellow human beings and their welfare that animated the public position which Ellen White and church leaders took. While some today will maintain that Adventist advocacy against alcohol was infringing on the personal rights of millions of people for what many have deemed a cultural right from at least the days of Noah, neither Ellen White nor her contemporaries in Adventist leadership saw it that way. It was their duty, they believed, to help their nation be better than it was, more sober than it was, more productive than it was, and more peaceful than it was. Prohibition for them was a natural expression of a set of biblical values which they had, pardon the pun, fully imbibed. You may believe what you will about freedom to use alcohol, even as a Bible-believing Adventist. But don't expect to find any support in Adventist history for your perspective, either from a textual basis or from a religious freedom basis. Three things have become increasingly clear from this survey of how Adventism's differing traditions and religious liberty have come to influence contemporary church policy and statements, including about expressions of alternative sexuality in our nations and cultures. Number one, in the last 175 years, Adventists have usually illustrated both great care and appropriate passion in the public statements they have made about difficult issues of public policy and social foundations. Those who don't know or choose to ignore the history of Adventist engagement with social issues may wrongly perceive that the church's key focus on its mission and the soon coming of Jesus have kept it out of the stream of its culture. This has never been the case, particularly in the first 80 years of this movement. In that era, Adventists adopted a very high-profile style of public engagement through publications, through open letters to presidents, and through voted policy pronouncements. Our tradition, far from being quiescent in the early decades of this movement, was, if anything, more vigorous and more anchored in our biblical foundations than it is in recent decades. Two, Adventists have always believed that their biblical faith has profound implications for their society as well. Yes, by means of model and education and example, but also through public advocacy where appropriate, through principled opposition to government policy when necessary, and through active engagement in electoral processes when the issues were sufficiently freighted with moral meaning. To be a Seventh-day Adventist does not mean checking your social conscience when you leave the sanctuary door, or abandoning biblically founded commitments to justice for the oppressed, the protection of the vulnerable, and the defense of those under attack because of their religious beliefs. Nor does it mean that we must acquiesce in the name of freedom of conscience to public advocacy for lifestyles in opposition to biblical norms. 3. Adventist public statements and policy pronouncements about the difficult issues of alternative sexual expressions in the public square must emerge from a biblical worldview, from a persistent commitment to the good of the society around us, and from a deep compassion for those who disagree with both our theology and our practice. In doing so, we do well to be guided by both the counsel and the example of Ellen White, who charted a way forward for Adventist engagement with social issues upon which no one, including A.T. Jones, has ever improved. Anything less is not worthy of our name as disciples of the Lord Jesus. We are disciples who are inhabiting the kingdoms of this world, but are leaning forward with all that we have and all that we are toward that day when the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ.